In the history of how nations die, there is usually the sound of cannon fire, the marching of boots, or the screaming of shells. We are taught that empires fall when their walls are breached, or their generals surrender. But in the 19th century, the greatest superpower of the Middle East was dismantled not by soldiers, but by accountants. It was conquered not with gunpowder, but with compound interest. This is the story of the first true debt trap in modern history. It is the story of how the Ottoman Empire, a titan that had terrified Europe for centuries, was slowly suffocated by the banks of London and Paris. It is a cautionary tale that echoes loudly in our modern world, because it demonstrates a brutal geopolitical truth. You do not need to invade a country to own it. You simply need to hold its mortgage. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must look at the Ottoman Empire in the middle of the 19th century. To the outside observer, it still appeared to be a colossus. It stretched from the Balkans and Europe, across the mountains of Anatolia, down to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and across the vast deserts of North Africa. The Sultan in Istanbul ruled over millions of subjects and sat on a throne that commanded the crossroads of the world. But beneath this surface of imperial majesty, the foundation was rotting. The empire was economically sick. While Britain and France were undergoing the Industrial Revolution, building steam engines, factories, and railways, the Ottoman economy remained frozen in a medieval agrarian past. It was a land of peasants and craftsmen, trying to compete in a world of machines. The treasuries of the Sultan were chronically short of cash, and the tax system was archaic, relying on corrupt local officials who stole half the revenue before it ever reached the capital. For centuries, the Ottomans had solved their cash flow problems with old-world tricks, debasing their currency or confiscating the wealth of rich officials. But in the 1850s, those tricks no longer worked. The world was changing, and the sick man of Europe was about to be offered a medicine that was actually a poison. For centuries, there was one line an Ottoman sultan would never cross: borrowing money from the infidels of Europe. To the Ottoman mind, debt was not just a financial burden, it was a religious and cultural humiliation. It was an admission that the caliphate, the shadow of God on earth, was subservient to the bankers of London. But in 1854, pride collided with the cold reality of industrial warfare. The Crimean War had broken out. The Ottomans were fighting alongside Britain and France to stop Russian expansion. But while the British brought steamships and the French brought rifled muskets, the Ottomans brought a treasury that was effectively empty. The cost of modern war was astronomical, too high for a medieval tax system to handle. The Sultan, Abdülmecid I, faced a choice: watch his empire be swallowed by Russia, or do the unthinkable. He reached out to the West for a loan. In 1854, the first loan was signed, a modest £3 million. To the Sultan, it felt like a temporary lifeline. To the bankers in the city of London, it was the smell of blood in the water. They knew something the Sultan didn't: that debt, once invited into the house, never leaves. The terms were predatory. The Ottomans were charged high interest rates because they were considered a high-risk investment. But the high interest wasn't the trap. The trap was the dependency. Once the first loan was spent, the Ottomans found they couldn't even pay the interest without taking a second loan. Between 1854 and 1874, the Ottoman Empire went on a borrowing binge. They took out 15 major international loans. Some of the money went to the military, but much of it was squandered on the appearance of modernity. Sultan Abdulaziz, obsessed with proving he was an equal to European monarchs, spent millions building the Dolmabahce Palace, a glittering, Baroque monstrosity on the Bosphorus filled with baccarat crystal and massive chandeliers. He was decorating a house that was already being foreclosed upon. By 1875, the math reached its breaking point. The empire was spending more than half of its total annual revenue just to pay the interest on its previous debts. They were running a global superpower on a payday loan. And in the financial centers of Europe, the smiles of the bankers were beginning to turn into the cold stares of debt collectors. The end did not come with a battlefield surrender. It came with a piece of paper. In 1875, the Ottoman Empire officially declared bankruptcy. It was a moment that sent shockwaves through the exchanges of London and Paris. For the European powers, this wasn't just a financial loss. It was a geopolitical opportunity. They didn't want their money back. They wanted the empire's sovereignty. In 1881, the Sultan was forced to sign the Decree of Muharrem. It is perhaps the most humiliating document in the history of the Middle East. With a stroke of a pen, the Ottoman Empire handed over the keys to its own house. The decree established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA. The OPDA was essentially a state within a state. It was a committee of European creditors who were given absolute control over the most profitable parts of the Ottoman economy. They took control of the silk tithes, the salt monopoly, the tobacco taxes, and the duties on spirits. European officials sat in Istanbul and intercepted the empire's wealth before the Sultan's own ministers could even touch it. To the average citizen in Beirut, Baghdad, or Cairo, the face of the government was no longer the local governor. It was the foreign debt collector. The British and French didn't need to garrison every city because they controlled the lifeblood of the administration. They had achieved the ultimate imperial dream. They were reaping the profits of a colony without the expense of ruling it. This was the invisible invasion. While the Sultan still sat in his palace, his power was a ghost. He couldn't build a road, buy a gun, or pay a soldier without the approval of the OPDA. The Ottoman Empire had become a hollow shell, a giant whose muscles had been replaced by British and French wiring. The Europeans now had a vested interest in keeping the sick man alive just long enough to extract every last drop of interest, but they were already drawing the lines on the map for how they would carve up the corpse. If the decree of Muharrem was the rope around the empire's neck, the Suez Canal was the stool being kicked from beneath its feet. To understand how the British finally moved from being creditors to being masters, we have to look south to Egypt, technically a province of the Ottoman Sultan, but in reality, a semi-independent state being run into the ground by its own leader, Khedive Ismail. Ismail was a man obsessed with the grandeur of the Day West. He famously declared that Egypt was no longer in Africa, but in Europe. He spent money with a madness that terrified even the most seasoned bankers. He built the Suez Canal, a feat of engineering that transformed global trade, but he did so by taking out loans at 12% interest while only receiving a fraction of the actual cash. By 1875, he was so desperate he was selling the very furniture in his palaces. On a cold November night in 1875, a telegram arrived in London. Ismail was desperate. He was offering to sell his 44% stake in the Suez Canal for £4 million. The British Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, didn't wait for Parliament to approve the funds. He famously borrowed the money from the Rothschild family in 48 hours. With that one check, Britain didn't just buy a canal, they bought the throat of the world's trade. But the debt didn't stop there. By 1882, the Egyptian people, tired of seeing their taxes go directly to European banks while they starved, rose up in a nationalist rebellion. For the British, this was the moment the mask of the friendly creditor dropped. They claimed they were not invading to conquer, but to protect their investments and ensure financial stability. In 1882, British warships bombarded Alexandria, and troops landed to occupy Cairo. The Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul could only watch in impotent rage as his most valuable province was effectively snatched away. The British told the world the occupation was temporary. It would last for 72 years. This was the template for the modern Middle East. The British didn't need a declaration of war. They used a default on a payment as a moral justification for a military takeover. They had turned the concept of debt into a weapon of mass destruction, and the Ottoman Sultan was now realizing that he was no longer a ruler, he was a tenant in an empire he no longer owned. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer a sovereign state. It was a ghost property, managed by a board of directors in London and Paris. The Great War of 1914 was merely the final liquidation sale. When the smoke cleared in 1918, the borders of the modern Middle East were not drawn to create nations or protect peoples. They were drawn by the creditors to secure the remaining assets, the oil of Iraq, the ports of the Levant, and the transit of the Suez. But the story of the Ottoman debt didn't end with the fall of the Sultan. When Mustafa Kemal Ataturk founded the Republic of Turkey from the ashes of the empire, he inherited a nation that was physically devastated and financially shackled. The European powers made it clear. If Turkey wanted to be recognized as a modern state, it had to honor the debts of the sultans. The new republic, poor and exhausted by decades of war, spent its first 30 years sending millions of dollars abroad to pay for the reckless spending of the 1850s. The final payment on the Ottoman debt was not made until May 25, 1954. It took exactly 100 years to pay for the first temporary lifeline. The story of the Ottoman debt trap is the ultimate lesson in the danger of financial dependency. The Ottomans thought they could import modernity. They thought they could buy the appearance of a great power using other people's money. They didn't realize that money is never neutral. Every loan is a tether, every bond is a chain. The British and the French didn't need to conquer Istanbul with soldiers. They simply waited for the compound interest to do the work. They proved that the most effective way to destroy an empire is not to attack it, but to lend it money it can never repay. The sick man of Europe didn't die of old age. He was foreclosed upon. And the lesson he left behind is written in the red ink of history. Sovereignty is not just about flags and borders. Sovereignty is about solvency. If you do not own your debt owns you. This is the Wealth History Channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve. Because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. History never repeats exactly, but it always rhymes.